with us. May the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
So let's start with a trivia question. What was Noah's wife's name? And no, it wasn't Debbie. Does anyone know Noah's wife's name? No one knows? Actually, that's the answer. No one knows. Her name is not mentioned in the Bible. It's the story of Noah and his ark. It's one of the best known stories, especially popular among kids. When you go out, you go into stores, you'll find all kinds of replicas for kids, stuffed animals, jigsaw puzzles, you name it. They make it for kids. But there's even life-size reproductions of the ark. The Ark Encounter in Kentucky, I know some of you have been there, has a full-size replica of the ark as per their interpretations. This replica took 3.1 million board feet of lumber to build. Now, you can imagine that is a lot of lumber. For those of you not familiar with the term, a board foot is a piece of wood that is 1 foot wide, 1 foot long, and 1 inch thick. What they used in the ark would be enough to build 250 average homes. If you're familiar with Frostburg, Maryland, there is a church up there named God's Ark of Safety. Back in the 60s, and yes, I do remember back in the 60s, the church wanted to build an ark. But they had meetings, they had fundraisers, but they could never come up with enough funds to build it. Lo and behold, an architect that did not go to that church stepped forward and offered to prepare plans. And then someone else stepped forward to provide the startup money for it. But instead of making it all out of wood, they decided to start the frame with steel. Unfortunately, after the frame was built, the funds ran out. But if you ever go through Frostburg, 168, if you're going east, look on your left. The framework is still there for a future ark. But who was Noah? And why did God want to destroy the earth? Well, Noah was the great, 9 times grandson of Adam. He was born 1,056 years after God created Adam. Noah did not have children until he was 500 years old. Can you imagine being 500 years old and having kids running around your household? So what happened in the 600 plus or minus years from Adam and Eve that made God want to destroy the earth? So let's start with Adam and Eve. Remember, the serpent enticed Eve, who enticed Adam, to go against the will of God and eat the apples from the forbidden tree. God was furious, punished Adam and Eve. And some of those punishments are still with us today. Then there was Adam's sons, Cain and Abel. Cain killed Abel because of Abel's favor with God, jealousy. So here's something you can ponder a little bit. God created the earth. He created Adam and Eve. And he created the people. But there was already a force working against God, an evil force. A force so strong that it tempted Adam and Eve with the fruit and the tree. A force that tempted Cain to kill his brother. This was the force of Satan. And that force still exists today. Remember you're growing up, and people used to say there's a little man on your left shoulder that's whispering in your ear the wrong things to do, and a little man on your right shoulder telling you the things to do. Well, think of that as Satan and God. You can take your fingers and get rid of that guy on the left. Well, as time moved on and on, more and more evil was on earth. Genesis 6 talks about the sons of God. So who are the sons of God? The sons of God are actually a mystery. There's quite a few theories out there. Some people have interpreted them to be descendants of Seth. Remember Seth? He was the son of Adam and Eve after Cain killed Abel. These people would have represented the godly side of Seth. Some people think the sons of God are fallen angels. Angels that were messengers from God to the earth, but revolted against his authority and became demonic. Other thoughts of sons of God were the human rulers that were powerful and evil. As well as there's some thoughts out there that they were non-human beings. No matter what the real origin is, these sons of God took a liking to the daughters of Adam. And they had children with them. This union produced the Nephilim. The Nephilim were great warriors, the biblical giants, and they are also evil. Possibly part of the reason God created the great flood was to destroy the Nephilim. When the Lord saw the corruption and the violence in his creation, he regretted that he had made human beings and wanted to destroy the earth to start over. But there was one righteous man that still found favor with God, and that was Noah. Out of all the people on the earth, he found one person he still favored. So the Lord said to Noah, Noah, build me an ark. Make it out of cypress with many rooms, and coat it with pitch inside and out. So for those of you that don't know what pitch is a product of pine sap. And you make pitch by heating up the pine sap and adding charcoal to it. If you ever watched National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, you remember the scene where they cut the tree down and they're going to bed and Clark's hands are sticking to everything? Well, think about that when you take that much pine sap and put on an ark. God continued. Make it 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Put a roof on it, leaving 1 cubit below the roof for an opening all around. Put a door in the side and make it with lower, middle, and upper decks. God gave pretty specific instructions for this, about the shape, the dimensions. Well, obviously, God had planned on how big it needed to be in order to accommodate Noah, his family, all the animals, all the food they needed, all the feed for the animals. There actually was a Korean research team that built models of several ancient vessels, including the ark. The dimensions of 300 cubits by 50 cubits is a 6-to-1 ratio. It turns out, of all the models tested, the ark was the most stable vessel for floodwaters. Isn't that hard to imagine God came up with the most stable vessel? Yeah, I don't think it's hard to imagine, but yes, God created the most stable vessel from those days. But to relate the size of the ark to our measurements today, a cubit is the length of a forearm. In those days, the carpenters didn't have a 6-foot rule in their back pocket. They didn't have a Stanley 25-foot tape hanging on their belt. So they used a forearm from your elbow to the tip of your middle finger as a cubit. So you can imagine different size of people, you're going to have different lengths of cubits. If you're buying something, you want a cubit this big. If you're selling it, you want it a little bit shorter. This kind of reminds me of property deeds, if you're familiar with property deeds. Back in the day, you used to get property deeds that read things as far as a man can ride a horse in one day, 75 turns of a wagon wheel, as far as I can see to the next mountain. These are all the same type of thing. There was no definition to those lengths. But now, the cubit is usually assumed to be 18 inches. So 300 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits would be 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet high. And yep, that is longer than a football field. So can you imagine when God was talking to Noah, what his thoughts were? How many years will it take me to cut all those trees and hand hew them into boards? I'm not young anymore. I'm over 600 years old. What will the neighbors say? They'll think I'm crazy building an ark where it hasn't flooded. As soon as I find my order of papers, where will the money come from? How will I get all the animals loaded? And no, there was not a Lowe's back then. Noah had to cut all the trees and hew them. There wasn't sawmills, so you had to hew them into boards. Although it's not told in the Bible, but it is estimated it took him up to 100 years to build the ark. Noah, being the righteous man and believing that God will take care of them, built the ark to the size God wanted, covered it with pitch, loaded his family and all the animals, and then the Lord shut them in. Going by God's directions, there would have been 6,700 animals loaded on the ark. 6,700. What a payload and what a smell. How much food would you have to take for that many animals, not knowing how long you're going to be out on a flood? And then it rained. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. And there's that biblical number again. Same as Jesus spending 40 days in the wilderness. Same as Moses spending 40 nights on the mountain receiving God's commandments. The Israelites spent 40 years in the wilderness before they got to the promised land. But did you ever notice in Genesis 7, verse 11, not only did it rain, but the fountains of the great deep burst forth. The flood came not from above, but also from below. Gushers of water from the ground below fed the floodwaters also. Now God was very specific about how to build the ark. Certain type of wood, certain dimensions, certain number of floors, dimensions of the roof height, covering it with pith. But you ever notice what wasn't specified? What wasn't mentioned? What God didn't think was needed for the ark? There is no mention of a bridge to steer from, or to be able to look out and see all the floodwaters. All you have is an 18-inch opening between the roof and the ark, but no place where you could get a clear view. But still, been nice to have. All right, someone messed my papers. There it is. Think about being stuck in the ark with all those animals. The smell, the stink, the bugs. The Bible doesn't mention bugs, but you're sure they came in with all the animals. Been nice to have a place to go up and get some fresh air. One of the most important things that wasn't specified was a rudder to steer with. No rudder, not even sails. There was no way to steer the ark. The ark just floated. So who was steering the boat? You could say it just floated around on the floodwaters like a fishing bobber, but the ark was actually being steered to a certain destination God wanted. Noah had absolutely no control of the boat, no input as to where he was going. He had to trust God, that God was keeping them safe, and taken them to where God wanted them to be. God was steering the ark. God was in total control of where it was going. Noah had faith and trusted God. Trusted God to deliver them to where God planned for them to be. He had trust in the Lord, real faith, real trust. A faith that outweighed any doubts, relieved any worries, a faith that surpassed all fears. Did you also notice God didn't mention to them how long they're going to be out there? How long he was just going to be floating around on floodwaters with no land, nothing to look at? Remember the book, Around the World in 80 Days? However, for Noah, the number of days was not specified in the Bible how long they were doing. But it is estimated they were floating around for 371 days. Over a year, just floating on floodwaters. Talk about faith in the Lord. Floating around on an ark, no idea where you're going, how long you'll be there, and you are just trusting God to take you there. Imagine what Noah and his ark went through, and his family. Get up in the morning, feed 6,000 animals, clean up after them. You eat, and then you just start all over again. Day after day, no end in sight. No land, only faith and trust in the Lord. That has to be depressing. Remember, there's no windows in the ark, so the ark is dark. Did you ever wonder, though, how they cooked their food? They're on a cypress boat covered in pine pitch. Both of them are very, very flammable. Now, how could they have a fire to cook? So have you been in a situation that you had absolutely no control of what was happening, or what the outcome was going to be? When you had no idea of where you were heading, or when you would get there, especially when you didn't create the situation to begin with, but you became a part of it, not by your choice. Did you put your trust in God? Trust God to steer you through it and to put you safe at the end? Or did you fret about it to the point you couldn't think straight? I think all of us have been in those situations at some point. There's nothing recorded that Noah had questions, no indication Noah worried about what was going to happen, where they were heading, what the outcome would be. Noah was given the command from God, and he did as commanded. He did not fret about the outcome. He had total faith. Where you lead me, I will follow. For I know that you will lead me to safety, and that you have a plan for me. This is the same type of faith that Moses had when God commanded him to lead his people out of Egypt to the promised land. No worries about food. No worries about where they were going. No second thoughts. Just trust and faith in God that he would direct them, provide for them, and deliver them to the promised land. So let's give you another can you imagine scenario. So God says to Moses, I want you to take your people and cross the desert to the promised land. I'm not telling you how long it will take, nor where your food is coming from, nor what will befall you on the way. Just trust in me and have faith. Trust in me and have faith, and I will deliver you to the promised land. Both of these men believed in God and allowed God to steer them, to direct them without question, without concern, without worry. Maybe a little bit of worry, but all the while knowing that God is there for them. Such drastic moves that disrupts and completely changes their lives and the lives of many others. Such faith is hard to perceive. Both of these men took on impossible missions. Kind of like the old show Mission Impossible. These were real life Mission Impossibles. Missions beyond one's imaginations. Think about how you would react if a voice came to you and said to build an ark or to take your people to a different land. Would you believe the voice? Or would you shake your head and think it was a dream? How would you react? I'm sure all of us would have some questions to that. You know the saying, when God closes one door, he will open another. Talk about having a door closed and having no idea where the other door is or when it will open. There was no light at the end of the tunnel, no light to see, no light to give them hope. But their trust in God carried them through their struggles. They never lost hope. They never lost faith. They never questioned God. Both men did as God commanded and just had their faith to carry them through. There's another part of the story to think about, and that is the water. What's the significance of the water? Not only as flood water, not as something that will leave the earth muddy for years, but what was God using the water for? And why water? Why not fire? Why not just block the sun if you wanted to destroy the earth? God was eliminating evil on earth. He was purifying the earth. Water purification. Cleansing water. Like the water that purifies the soul at baptism. Water that cleanses. Water that renews. And like the living water, to live in as Jesus told the Samaritan lady at Jacob's well. Water that saved Moses from the Egyptians. Water that sustains life. So what happened to Noah's Ark? Well, after 371 days afloat, Noah's Ark settled down on Mount Ararat. And since they lost their GPS power halfway through, there is no known location of it. However, they've had several archaeological searches for it. The most recent has been looking at an area in Turkey. And there's an area there that has the shape of an ark. They have taken core samples, and the core samples are encouraging. And they've also done ground-penetrating radar. And this is showing more encouragement as it is showing a structure with a long hallway and different floors. So let me ask you how strong your faith is. If God appeared and gave you a commandment, like he gave Noah or Moses, would you have the faith and trust to comply? If God told you to sell all your possessions and go help the poor in another country, would you be able to do that? Do you have that commitment to be able to act unquestionably? Would you be able to move out of your comfort zone for God? There's a man that attends church with us here. He gave up a good job, a big paycheck, and followed God's command to become a minister. He was a little like Jonah, resisted at first, but God wore him down. A total change of life for him and his family. This is a man that has the trust and the faith that God and Noah had. So let me leave you with one last thought to ponder. The flood covered the entire earth, covered the mountains. Think about how high it was. Think about how much water that was. Think about how much it weighed. So your thought to ponder this week. Where'd all that water go? Amen.